going to move on to Assembly Member Prince now, and there's a couple of other Assembly members who may decide to follow up on some of the points that he's going to raise. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Debbie. How are you? What impact has the 2018-22 EDI strategy had on reducing inequalities in London, and how can you evidence this impact?
So it's a good question.
Thanks.
So I guess one of the things that I would pick would probably be the adult education budget. One of the really important things about the objectives and the strategy are that they show the way in which the Mayor is using his roles and responsibilities to tackle inequalities. And one of the ways that he can do that is with regards to the way he uses that £320 million budget. We know that one of the key elements of the budget has been to enable people who don't have access to the skills that they need to be able to progress, to apply for good work that pays well. And we know that since 2019, there have been around 500,000 Londoners who have been able to either access further or higher level qualifications or training, been able to access higher level or degree level apprenticeships, been able to get themselves into higher skilled work. And that's a really important set of statistics, and it's also really important because it shows that these are individuals who are able to either avoid poverty risk or to really just benefit from opportunity. What's also really good about that from an equalities perspective is that it's had a benefit to those individuals for whom we know accessing additional skills is really important. So around, I think it's around 69% of those learners were women, and around 58% of them were from a minority ethnic background, and around 13% were disabled or stated that they had a learning difficulty. So the use of that money in that way is really having the impact that we would like to see for those Londoners. I guess one other impact that I'd probably note is housing. Again, it's one of the areas where the Mayor has a key responsibility to ensure that all individuals have access to housing that's affordable, housing that's accessible. And we know that between 2020 and 22, there are around 32,000 housing starts, affordable housing starts, and from the objectives that we would have sent to you that hopefully you've all had a chance to see, we know that the individuals who are accessing that housing are the sorts of individuals who we know are more likely to live in cramped conditions, the individuals who are more likely to find themselves experiencing real difficulty because of the cost that they pay in the private rented sector, for example. So they're more likely to be African, Caribbean, Bangladeshi. We know that half were previously homeless. So these are the sorts of individuals for whom we think the Mayor's activities in this regard are really having the benefit that we want to see.
Thank you. So taking some of those points, you mentioned poverty. Chapter 1 of the 2019-22 report includes launching London Power as a key achievement. Given the state of London Power with poor customer acquisition and the fact that it may actually be wound down later this year, how do you justify listing that as an achievement? Surely that's a failure.
So I know that in the current cost of living crisis in which we find ourselves, that access to affordable energy has become an increasing issue. I can't comment on the state of London Power, I'm afraid. I would be happy, though, to put any question that you have to the Deputy Mayor for Environment and Energy for her to give you a response in relation to London Power. But I do know that in respect of some of the other initiatives that the Mayor has been developed in this space, that he has been really seeking to ensure that people are able to have access to advice through his Warmer Homes Advice Service. And also he has been, together with the Energy Saving Trust, been working to ensure that all Londoners, regardless of their income, have access to good quality advice around making savings on energy bills and advocating on behalf of them if they have any difficulties with their energy providers. So he has been doing work in that space, but with regards to London Power, it's not something that I have any detail on that I could share with you.
Yeah, I appreciate that you may not have the detail to comment on London Power, but it is your report where you're claiming it as an achievement, and it is not. Sorry,
may I ask which report you're referring to?
Chapter 1.
Strategy in 2018?
Chapter 1, it's the EDI strategy, and it says 1822. It says Chapter 1 of the 2019 to 22 report includes launching London Power as a key achievement. But it isn't an achievement, is it? Okay, let's move on. You talked about the Higher Education Fund, and it was an issue actually when the fund was first launched that we failed to fund Harlow College, but thank you. I spoke with people, and after my intervention, Harlow is now being funded because a lot of people from London use Harlow College, and they also have a satellite unit in Stansted Airport. So, you know, ultimately we got there, so thank you for that. But Chapter 3 of the 2019-20 Equalities Report shows that the proportion of economically active Londoners between the ages of 16 and 64 receiving training has fallen progressively over time. It was 23% in 2019 compared to 29% in 2004. So given the Mayor's £3 million plus adult education budget, do you agree that that's disappointing, that the number of those engaged has dropped from 29% to 23%?
I have no detail on as to why those individuals might have dropped off. Could you perhaps explain who are the individuals for whom this is
active Londoners aged 16 to 64 receiving training?
So there are a few
economically active Londoners. Well, I'll write to you, Debbie. How about that?
That would be really helpful, actually, so I can give you a more detailed answer.
That's fair enough. Okay. So if we look at Chapter 4 now of the 2019-2020 Equality Report, shows that public transport satisfaction fell slightly for most modes of transport, except for trams, between 2016-17 and 2018-19. Amongst disabled Londoners, the fall in satisfaction was worse for taxis and the underground. So can you tell me what further action will you be taking to improve transport satisfaction for disabled Londoners?
So I think one of the things that's important to mention at this juncture is that the revised objectives no longer include objectives for transport, and that's largely because the transport team and TfL have their own separate equality objectives that they published last year, and in those objectives they will hopefully and helpfully be trying to address any of those concerns that have been raised by disabled travellers at that time. I do regularly meet with deaf and disabled people's organisations. We have a quarterly roundtable. I'd be more than happy to raise this as an issue with those attending in light of what you've raised at this meeting, and be happy to come back and let you know what they have said in response to that, if that would be helpful.
That's very kind. So, but just for clarity, so are you saying that as the person responsible for EDI, you're no longer going to be looking at transport as being one of your responsibilities?
So when my responsibility is not to hold all the different parts of the GLA to account. The really important work that is necessary for me to do is to ensure that equalities is embedded in everybody's work, so that everyone has their own responsibility for taking forward equalities. And so the fact that TfL have their own set of obligations and objectives with regards to equality is really important, because the best way to try to shift many deep-seated and entrenched inequalities across society is to have everyone take responsibility for tackling inequality, to set their own objectives, to have their different ways of being held accountable for that. So TFL, sorry, I'll just finish and then obviously do follow up. So TFL, as well as MOPAC, who have their own equality objectives also, TFL having their own objectives really does show that they are embedding inequalities within their own work, taking responsibility for the way in which they monitor, the way in which they proactively promote equality is actually really important from my perspective as a person who has responsibility for equality and has equality expertise.
Are you saying that you're satisfied that TFL now have sufficient rules and regulations embedded that you can... Would you not want to still have some oversight of that though?
Well, it's not necessary for me to have oversight over TFL because I'm sure that they come to the London Assembly to report on.
Yeah, but you are the person in charge of equality for the GLA, aren't you?
Yeah, yes, and
isn't that part of our family? Isn't the GLA? Isn't the transport
it's a functional. Yes, it's part of the function. It's part of the functional family. Yes, but it's not.
So would you
GLA.
ensure then at least that TFL give the equality and the basic human right for bus drivers to use the toilet at the end of a route? Could you ensure that as a basic human right, do you think?
Can I assure that bus drivers
have the ability to go to the toilet at the end of a route?
Do they not currently have the ability to go to the toilet?
Many routes don't have toilets at the end of the route.
Well, then that is definitely something that TFL would have to include within their equality objectives.
Will you ensure that they do?
I mean, I can talk to Seb Dance and I can talk to the transport team, but I don't have actual responsibility for TFL and the way in which they promote equality.
Sorry to interrupt in this, but I think you've actually uncovered something that makes our scrutiny of the EDI objectives and strategy really very difficult. If you're saying that there's a whole section that TFL has set their own EDI targets, which is very welcome. I like the idea of it being embedded, but we don't have somebody from TFL here today, and so Assemblymember Prince is quite rightly trying to cross-question you about this. So really we need to know who the person is who would be responsible, and I would hope that our committee clerks and our scrutiny team would be able to find that out. Perhaps you would be able to help share with that name.
I'd be happy to do that, definitely.
But you also mentioned MOPAC is doing the same in relation to the police. And now, I wouldn't want to step on the toes, and I can see an awful lot of members of the Transport Committee who are surrounding me on this committee, and there are members of the Police and Crime Committee who are here, but surely as a joined-up approach, oversight should be looking at how EDI is being dealt with across all different parts of the GLA family. And I haven't mentioned the LFB, but obviously the same would apply. I mean, is the committee content that we should try? Well,
as a member of the Transport Committee, Chair, I would welcome it that we have we have a very thorough scrutiny of EDI across all our family.
Yeah. Okay. I can't see any objections coming from other members of the committee.
It does beg the question, and I don't mean to be offensive, what you actually do.
It's not offensive at all. It's a fair question. So I have responsibility for ensuring that all of the work that we do across the GLA includes the voices of Londoners. So a lot of the engagement activity that I do is with people with different protected characteristics, organisations that represent them, and I ensure that all of that work feeds into the work that we do. I also have the responsibility now that we have the recovery board and the objectives, and I'm sure we'll be able to discuss those in a bit more detail. But I do have that responsibility of ensuring not just the work of the GLA and the Mayor is promoting all of the equality objectives that we've published last year, but also I'm now working with partners across all of the decision-making bodies in London through the Building a Fairer City Action Plan, which includes the Met, it includes LFB, it includes the Church of England, it includes a vast array of other organisations. And so I'm engaging with them and ensuring that they work with us to try to achieve some of the bigger issues around inequalities.
When you're asked questions on it, you're pushing it to somebody else's responsibility. That was my point.
Can I? Is it possible just to clarify just on this point, because there may be a question on this later. We took the decision, as you'll probably have realised, in the original strategy there were 39 objectives, and those included safety, they included transport. And we took the decision in the wake of the pandemic and in the wake of the cost of living crisis, and also just the way in which inequality was laid bare by the pandemic, to reduce the number of objectives from 39 to 14. And we did that because it's incredibly important for us to ensure that we have a sufficient number of objectives in which we can properly measure progress. 39 was a huge number of objectives. I do remember coming to Oversight back in 2019 and answering questions on the enormous number of objectives that were included in that strategy. And those were fair questions that were put to me by members of Oversight. Some of you were in that committee and in that meeting at the time. So we've made the decision to reduce those objectives. They are now closely aligned to the way in which GLA budget is.
I am actually going to stop you because we are going to come on to this in a minute.
Sorry,
but
just
I think we're just concerned about doing joined up scrutiny. And one of the reasons why I'm particularly keen to do joined up scrutiny is, as I'm sure we're all aware, that we've got both the fire brigade and the police in inverted commas special measures at the moment around a number of elements that relate to equality, diversity, and actually, frankly, a lack of inclusion. However, I'm just going to leave that there because I've now got about half a dozen Assembly members who've indicated that they would like to come in. I know. You're nearly finished. Okay, because we've got quite a lot of people now backed up.
So much interest. I apologise. Indeed. So, if we can now, well, I know that you've said that I'll be kind and relinquishing your responsibility on transport, but of course, I believe the plight of disabled Londoners and those on lower incomes must come under your remit. And ironically, could you tell me what consideration you've given to the impact of the expanded ULEZ on those two groups, please? Because I have a burgeoning email account of people every day writing me to tell me how painful this is. Perhaps I could forward all those to you, actually, of people who are going to be really suffering as a result of the expanded ULEZ, who are either elderly, disabled, and or unable to afford it, and may have to give up their jobs, certainly stop volunteering and everything. I just don't think it was properly thought through. But what will you be doing to support those people as the Equalities Deputy Mayor?
Thank you. So with regards to ULEZ, as I've mentioned before, with the Deaf and Disabled People's Roundtable that I hold quarterly, we've had a couple of discussions on ULEZ. We've also facilitated a range of interactions between those organisations, Inclusion London, which is the umbrella organisation, Transport for All, who meet regularly with TfL, and with the energy teams, the environment teams, and the transport teams, and TfL themselves. So I facilitated a lot of those meetings, and I have made sure that all of the requests and concerns that have been raised by those individuals have been passed on to the Mayor and to TfL and to the environment team. I think one of the things that's really important about ULEZ and the decision that's been made and the decision that the Mayor has made with regards to mitigations and scrappage is that he has definitely listened to the deaf and disabled people's organisations and individuals who make representations to me, and who have made representations to him. And I certainly do believe that the grace periods that he's introduced specifically for disabled people, so there is a disabled people's grace period which has specifically been set up, which will allow those individuals with wheelchair accessible vehicles to have a 2-year exemption period. He's also extended those who are on various disability benefits to include those who have got both the standard rate mobility component and the higher rate mobility component to be able to be part of that grace period and therefore have exemptions. And also the extent to which the scrappage scheme also enables those who are seeking to adapt their vehicles. He has made sure that there is a sufficient amount in that scrappage scheme to take all of that into consideration. So I think what's important from my perspective and from the individuals who make representations to me, and at one of the last meetings that we had, and we'd be happy to share the minutes with the committee if you would be interested, those individuals have said that they are happy that they have been listened to. And they are happy that the mitigations, particularly around benefits and the mitigations around wheelchair accessible vehicles, have been listened to also. And with regards to those on the lowest incomes, I know that the extension of the scrappage scheme from, I believe it was around £60 million in the last expansion to Inner London, but extending it to £110 million, I think, is an incredibly generous package. And including those individuals on means-tested benefits is incredibly important. And that will also include those individuals who are in work and in poverty, because we know that there are a huge number of individuals who are in working poverty, who make claims, universal credit claims, who will be able to avail themselves of the scrappage scheme. So I think in response to, I'm sorry this is a long-winded response, but I certainly do feel that for those who've made representations to me, particularly from the deaf and disabled community, they feel as though they have been listened to, and that's actually really important.
Oh, well, thank you for that long answer. But what we really want is an assurance that, unlike last time, the scrappage scheme won't run out of money, because a lot of people who would have qualified didn't get the money because the scrappage scheme ran out. But I'll leave it at that. Then two more, very short questions. Whether we get short answers is not under my control. So Chapter 5 of the Equality Report shows that the number of victims of domestic violence incidents has increased to over 3,000 people between 2018 and 19. Or 2%. What further actions are you taking to help reduce domestic violence, Deputy Mayor?
So you'll be aware that last year the Mayor produced the Violence Against Women and Girls policy alongside the Police and Crime Plan. And I know that this is something that the Mayor has taken incredibly seriously alongside the Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime. Certainly, I know that in the work that I do with Sophie, we both chair the Disproportionality Board, that it's hugely important that MOPAC, the Mayor, is working really closely with the Met to ensure that they are doing all they can to support victims of domestic violence. And I think that the strategy, the Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, is a good one. It's one which was circulated widely to deputy mayors, and I certainly did discuss it with Sophie and commented on it. And I think it's something which we are hoping, in the way in which it is targeting and specifically putting the responsibility on perpetrators and having men recognise what is and is not acceptable behaviour, is a really important move to make.
I won't pursue that. Finally, you'll be pleased to know, Chair, this is a very short question, hopefully shorter answer. 2019-20 Annual Equality Report does not report on Chapter 6. Chapter 6, or the objectives, Chapter 6, just for those not in the know, focuses on what the Mayor can do to ensure that the GLA group is leading by example to promote equality, diversity and inclusion. Do you know why you haven't bothered to report on that?
No, I don't, sorry, and I'll have to look into that and come back to you. Chapter 6, did you say? Okay.
Chapter 6 is, so it's about the Mayor ensuring that the GLA group, as we actually discussed it, is leading by example to promote equality, diversity and inclusion. And in the report, and I checked on the report a bit earlier, it doesn't mention Chapter 6.
Okay, I will look into that and come back to you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Assemblymember Prince, I just want to check if Assemblymember McCartney did want to come in, because you did indicate earlier on that you might wish to come in on
yes, if I
this
can.
group of questions.
Yes, and this is a bit to be helpful, and I hope it is. So, it seems to me that some of the questions that Assemblymember Prince was asking you about TfL and toilets, which is a real issue. Obviously, GLA family, its organisations have their own governing board, which will have their own EDA strategy, so they are ultimately responsible to those. So in your role, setting out the wider priorities, I suppose it's what input do you have into, for example, TfL or whatever, and what can you do in your role to make sure that they are meeting the broader goals, and do you have any, if you like, oversight of them that you can... I'm assuming you can't direct them if you're not happy with it. It has to go through their own governance structures, and I'm just wondering how that works.
So, thank you. With the TfL equality strategy, equality objectives, they were sent to me for comment. TfL got in touch with me and asked me for my views, asked me to comment, asked me to give any steers or directions. So I do have that role when it comes to their equality objectives. They will come to me and they will ask for my advice, for my steer, for my guidance. When it comes to broader oversight and monitoring as how it develops, my role does not extend to oversight of how they develop. The role that I have is in relation to oversight of the GLA's work, and all of the objectives are set out and published are principally about the GLA's work. However, that does not prevent me from having conversations with other functional bodies. I have had conversations with LFB in relation to their culture review, and I talk extensively with Fiona Twycross about the outcome of that review. Also, even though I don't have that oversight or accountability for the VORG strategy or for the police and crime plan, I am a member of the London Crime Justice Board, and I do meet regularly with Sophie and with MOPAC teams to look at the ways in which their work is developing. So I don't monitor the development, but I'm not distant from it, and I do ensure that if guidance or support can be given, I will give it, definitely.
Okay, thank you. Chair, I think my other question I wanted to ask, this is probably more or less covered in the answers that have been given already.
Okay, thanks very much. And I had Assemblymember Bakari wanted to come in as well at this point. Then
Yeah,
Assemblymember Fortune, Russell and Baker. But you're okay. Okay.
Well, I can go, yeah, whichever.
Right, brilliant. I wanted to touch on a question that is actually within our related questions here that I don't think we really touched on enough, which was on measuring the impact of the EDI strategy. Because at the end of the day, what we really need to do, and this is why it's so important, we need to reduce inequalities, and the strategy is supposed to help us reduce inequalities. How are you going to make sure that you can present the data, the impact that it's having on the evidence that this will reduce inequalities, because at the end of the day we do need to scrutinise and measure the impact that the strategy is going to have, and particularly on groups that haven't been mentioned so far. I mean, when I was looking through, I didn't see any mention of asylum seekers and refugees. There's so many other groups that are actually missed. Gypsy Roma community, for example, that are not within this.
So they're not being included doesn't mean that the work doesn't cover them at all. Any groups that were mentioned in the objectives that you will see will have just been as an example. But as all of you will know, the way in which we conduct equality at the GLA includes groups that are not covered by equality legislation. So refugees and asylum seekers are not covered by equality legislation, and neither are those on low-income groups, but we still include them. So if they're not mentioned, that doesn't mean that they're not included. But the point on measurement and monitoring is an important one. It's necessary to reduce inequalities, otherwise there's no point having a strategy or objectives. These objectives have now been closely aligned with with the missions and foundations approach that the GLA is now taking, both to its budget but also to its corporate reporting strategy. The London Assembly, so all of you will receive the dashboards, the quarterly reporting dashboards that monitor the progress that different teams are making against their programmes.
We're sort of getting into some of your future questions here, so I'm sorry to draw that. Can I just draw that to a close and go back to Assembly Member Fortune, who wanted to come in, hopefully in relation to the area that we were just touching on. And can I just remind members that we probably need to pick up the pace slightly, because the Deputy Mayor can't be with us beyond 4:45, I believe.
I shall get a wiggle on. One was picking up on what Assembly Member McCartney was saying, and then what Assembly Member Prince was saying. So starting with Assembly Member McCartney, just to further understand this. So I understand you have responsibility for the EDI, and then there's an element, it seems, of sort of kind of outsourcing, for want of a better word, for the actual operational delivery of it, and then you step in to understand what they're doing and then bring that report together. Is that fair to say?
The outsourcing bit, perhaps not. So
TfL's responsibility for EDI sits with TfL. You don't go in there and drive it. You say to them, what are you doing?
Yes, exactly. Right. I think, so really importantly, in order to do the work, it has to be embedded in what they do. So they have to take responsibility for it. They have come to me in the development of their strategy and their objectives. And I do come in. The thing is that I do come in when there is an issue. So I have been working really closely with Fiona Twycross and LFB with regards to their culture review. But they have responsibility for monitoring their own progress against it.
And then that would be, sorry, because I'm just mindful of time, that would be the same with other functional bodies. You mentioned MOPAC. Who else has the responsibility for doing their own EDI work in the GLA family? What I kind of want to get to is, for public watching this, they get a bit confused with GLA, London Assembly, So what bit do you do? What bit do you drive? And what bit do you manage?
So the bit that I drive is the GLA's work and the Mayor's work, and all of the teams.
So what doesn't that include? That's probably a better way of asking.
So that wouldn't include. So that doesn't include the functional bodies' day-to-day operational
TfL,
work.
no?
So TfL
MOPAC,
operational
no?
day-to-day equality, no.
London
MOPAC
Fire Brigade,
day-to-day, no.
Okay.
No. But when there is an issue, as there has been, so I've mentioned the culture review, I have come in to work with Fiona and others in relation to that. But they have responsibility, OPDC, all of the functional.
So we're looking at everything other than policing, transport, fire and building?
So yes, but importantly, as a caveat, there are areas of work where I am jointly working with some of those teams. So with MOPAC, I jointly work with them on the action plan on transparency, which was launched by the Mayor in 2020. So I do have a responsibility for ensuring the development of that, definitely.
Right.
So where I have a joint responsibility, then I will step in.
So there's a sort of chairing function, really, of bringing their independent reports together?
Yes.
Because it's your name on the bottom of the report. I guess that's, if I were in your chair, that's what I'd be a little bit uneasy about, is that I'd be reporting on EDI for TfL, saying it wasn't actually my work.
So
I don't mean that disrespectfully.
My name's not on their report, so my
yeah.
name's not on the TfL report. The TfL report is theirs.
I think
so my name's not
Assembly Member Fortune, we've
objectives.
established that we need the names supplied by Dr. Weekes-Barnard to Scrutiny and Committee Services, so we know who we can approach about the work that on EDI in TfL. Someone from MOPAC and also someone from the LFB as to who is leading on that. No, I'm going to come to...
So I'm just a second, sorry, Keith.
You said MOPAC, but also the Met itself, would you not say?
Well, I want to start with MOPAC, but there may be someone in the Met as well. But the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime surely is the right place for managing the EDI processes. And I do want to move on because we are starting to run short of time, and Assembly Member Baker wanted to come in.
This is my intervention later on, but we've talked about it so much. I think it's most appropriate now, and I want to come back to the wisdom or not of sort of devolving EDI targets to various functional bodies, and I particularly want to use the example of transport because that's what I'm most used to. And the advantage of the 2018 strategy is it had pretty high level pretty high level objectives that address the whole range of impacts that there might be on various people who are disadvantaged. And particularly I'm looking at like one that was talking about more affordable transport, really, really basic. That is a good thing to have. And then if you look at TfL's objectives, equality objectives, they're very, very specific, and they don't cover things as wide as that. And for me, that might lead us to the situation that we saw last year, where our most affordable form of transport, the bus, was going to be radically cut. So it seems to me that somewhere potentially the big overarching political directions, which really would help people, are being lost when now I absolutely agree that the TfL need to have ownership of those, but are they getting the political direction from that wider EDI strategy if actually we narrow our objectives, or the GLE narrows its objectives to things it has direct, or it says direct responsibility for? Does that make sense?
I'm going to bring, so Tom's really, hopefully Tom will say what I was going to say, but let's see what he says.
I suppose I was just trying to clarify a point on the legislation, and there's obviously lots of detail in there, so it may be helpful to follow up in writing as the committee.
I think that would be good. Yes.
In terms of the Equalities Act, the way in which the duty applies is all of those bodies are listed separately. It is in Schedule 19 of the Equalities Act. So it is not, as it were, a sort of a case of a choice that Dr. Weekes-Barnard or anyone else has made to devolve those responsibilities and say that
apologies.
The GLA, TfL, etc., are all listed as separate public bodies within the Schedule of the Act, and so that requirement by law falls on them all to do that as a separate process.
I'm not saying they shouldn't. Let me be clear. I said they should, and it's right, and they should take ownership. But what I'm saying is, by dropping the wider political EDI objectives, like more affordable transport, are we not giving TfL that? Because honestly, I've just skimmed through reminded myself of their equality objectives, and they're all great, but they are very specific. They're very TfL. They're very, we will do X, Y, and Z, and and I'm sure it's similar for LFB. I'm sure it's similar for MOPAC. So I expect it is anyway. But I feel like we're not trying to do the job for them, but is the GLA here missing a trick in terms of giving the direction about what the best interventions are to help Londoners overall?
So in addition to Tom's answer, I think it's an important point. Yeah. I think what's important about it is that ultimately the Mayor is concerned that individuals, so with affordability, that we are doing all we can to ensure that they can reduce costs and increase incomes. And that's a very broad aim, I guess, and vision. And then within that, there are the things that he has responsibility for. And so some of them I've listed. I've talked about AB and I've talked about housing. I think the issue with regards to having individual institutions take on responsibilities, that is the ultimate aim, I think, from doing good equalities work. I think the broader scope of making sure that everyone has affordable access to all services is still a laudable aim, and I don't think that has disappeared. I think what's important to note is that strategy that